Hi, Alan. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
Morning, Ethan. Great to be with you. I'm all good. I'm in the middle of London, Carnaby Street. It's all buzzing, sort of.
I want to talk about your book first, actually. It's a brilliant book. I would tell you before we started, I've only got one chapter of it left, so it's been a good read. When did the book first come to you? When did you want to write a book?
Well, I had this in my head, I think, for about 40 years or something. And in the 80s, I was touring a lot with the Stones and Bowie. And all that sounds glamorous, really a lot of touring. You're on your own in hotels, far away. And in those days, you didn't have social media. It was quite lonely. So I'd often be scribbling notes and writing stuff down. And also, I got the feeling that I was living through history because, rock and roll was kind of new then and it was breaking all these barriers. So I started writing stuff down and then I started telling these stories over the years, particularly with journalists when we'd go, be hanging around backstage or we'd be waiting in a hotel corridor for someone and I'd say, everyone was bored. I said, hey, did I tell you that time about I played football with Bob Marley or when the Stranglers did something? And so I really got these stories they became almost sort of part of my thing. Everyone expected me to tell a story. And people kept saying, well, why don't you put them in a book? And eventually I did. That's sort of how it happened. So it's been quite a long journey, really.
It is a brilliant book, and you've lived an extraordinary life. I just want to go back to the start, really. How did your journey
Yeah.
into the music business start?
Yeah, well, depends how far back we go. When I was at school, I was really I was really into football. Then I was really into music, and I was writing to the music papers, asking for jobs and not getting them. And then I got a job driving a van for a laundry van in South London in Battersea. It was called the Marie Blanche Laundry, and I used to bomb around the West End, going to hotels and getting all the dirty sheets and all the laundry out the back of the hotels, like the Dorchester and Claridge's. And I laugh about that because years later I'd be going to the front of these same hotels and they'd be tipping the hat to me, and I'd still dealing with people's dirty washing. But anyway, so then I got a job. Someone told me about a job at Sounds and Record Mirror. Sounds, and they were music papers, and I got in there and I started reviewing the bands because no one else really wanted to be. I was really into pub rock, which is the sort of forerunner of punk, So it was Doctor Kilburn and the High Roads, Doctor Feelgood, all that kind of stuff. And I was out every night seeing all these bands in Camden and stuff like that. So they let me review stuff because literally no one else was doing it. And then I was at a gig at Bingley in Staffordshire reviewing the Who for I think Sounds. And afterwards, I met the PR, who's a doyen of PRs, Keith Altham. He looked after everyone who'd been at Woodstock, Eric Burden, Stones. And he said to me, would you like a job in PR? And I thought, well, not really. It all looks a bit ducking and diving. I'd rather be a journalist. But I was struggling to pay my rent, which was £4 a week in Islington. And I thought, well, I could do this for a while and get my finances sorted. And that was 50 years ago.
What do you think it was about yourself that Keith Altham asked you if you wanted to be a PR?
That's a good question, that which no one else has asked me. And I think he must have seen in me. I mean, I'm a natural, not only am I natural communicator. As a kid, I was a talker. So when I would go down the street, I talk to everybody in the street, and it could be anybody, bloke digging the road, someone on the bus, and I used to it was then football. I'd say, oh, what about this player? And then it became music. Have you heard that album? I couldn't help myself. It was like I was on a evangelical about this sort of stuff, and it came naturally to me. And I guess Keith must have spotted that. I wasn't even really sort of aware of it, really.
What attributes or personality traits do you need to be a PR, do you think?
Well, I think you need to like all kinds of people. You need to get on with everyone from every single background. You can't afford, so you have to be, I like to think of myself as a sort of, I love the world, in that sense. So because you never know what situations and once you're into it, you're meeting people from all around the world and all kinds of environments. And then the other things you need are really, which I definitely had, was hard work ethic, You know, you need to, it's a lot of it is a slog behind the sort of really behind the scenes. You're calling people up, asking them to write about things. Um, and someone once described me as being like a rubber ball that you sort of drop me on the floor and I bounce higher. So you kind of need that. You need some inner strength because you get a lot of knocks in this kind of job and you slip back and you get fired and you think it's all over. So you have to have a sort of, a real self sort of inner strength. But also for me, I was really passionate about music. I love music. I listened to it all day, every day, even now. And that weirdly, that kept me going through some of the bad times as well.
I know you said it was a chance meeting at the Who gig, but would you say is it life in PR is as much as who you know, right, as much as what you know?
No, I don't think I would say that. And especially not now, the way it is with social media. So, I mean, we take on new people all the time. People come to me. If someone, there was a guy called Jack came to us about a couple of years ago, and he was moving some stuff in. He was like working for, moving some desks in, and I got chatting to him, and he was really good about music, and I thought he really would. Maybe he could be a PR. I didn't know at that time he was actually in a band called the Magic Gang, who were quite a cool, successful band. But anyway, Jack ended up working for us, and like he's one of our senior PRs now, and he's great. And he was a bit, it was probably a bit like the way Keith hired me. I just felt this guy's got a natural feel for talking about music. So yeah, it's not an old boy network. It's not about knowing people in that way. I don't think at all. So, as an inspiration to anyone who's watching, if you really want to do it, I'm sure you can make it happen.
In the book, you mentioned you learned a lot from Keith Alford, Malcolm
Yeah,
McLaren, Mick Jagger.
yeah.
Is PR work all about learning, like he's still learning today and stuff?
Every single day. I'll be a better PR at the end of today than I was yesterday, and so on. The second you think you know it all, then you're going to start slipping and making mistakes. Because one thing is, the media changes all the time, and journalists changing, and they're coming and going. There's new people writing. I mean, say I've worked with the Sun, obviously, as you would in this job over all this time. I mean, I must have dealt with 50 or 60 editors of Bizarre by now, the column. So there's always a new person, and you've always got to develop a relationship. And I just sent an email to the editor of the Observer magazine yesterday. I've never met her. And I said, "Oh, can we have a coffee? Let's have a chat because I'm promoting the Youngblood album. You might be interested." And you still make, even at my level of experience, you can still make mistakes. You can misjudge a thing and think, well, how's someone going to review that record? So no, you're learning. Once you stop learning, you should probably pack it in.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Mick Jagger, the Stones were one of your early jobs. What were they like to work with?
Brilliant, ruthless, professional, what you'd expect. And I started working in 81. So they were still pretty dangerous then. It was the last era before they became more sort of, corporate, if you like. So Keith and Mick weren't particularly getting on at that time. And it was like dealing with entirely different individuals. And it would be wild. Keith would only do interviews maybe after midnight, and you'd have to go up to his room, and it would be dark and kind of sort of lights covered in drapes and stuff like that, and some reggae record playing in the background. Mick, on the other hand, liked to do his interviews first thing in the morning, i.e., 7 o'clock in the morning when he was out jogging, and you'd have Richard Young doing a pitch, and we'd do an interview, and then Charlie would never do them. Bill Wyman. Yeah, Bill Wyman would do stuff during the day. Bill Wyman sort of went to bed straight after the show. So he'd come off the stadium and go and have a cup of tea and go have an early night, after he'd played in front of 100,000. Whereas for Keith, the day really began with the gig and he'd probably be up all night. So what I found working for the band was that you were really working around the clock. So it was incredibly exciting. I mean, talk about learning. I was learning by the second, but really exhausting physically and mentally. And of course, Mick Jagger has got most brilliant marketing mind. So all the time you're under pressure because it'd be like, oh, we're doing this show in Essen in Germany, and we need to sell more tickets, or Dusseldorf, and what's so I'd be going into these towns, and I'd walk into, say, Munich, somewhere I'd never been, or Milan or whatever. And my first thing I'd have to do is go to the newspapers or the music papers and get to meet the writers and hang out with them and make instant relationships. Some of those people I'm still friendly with now, all this time later. And then I'd run down to the gig to make sure the seats were right and the ticketing was right. And so such a level up from what I'd been used to. Now I'd worked with the Stranglers and the Buzzcocks and the Damned, all brilliant groups in different ways, great managers. But the scale of this, they were playing, if you like, clubs or theatres. Suddenly, with the Stones, it was worldwide and it was football stadiums. So the whole scale of the thing was really big. So yeah, it was a pretty steep learning curve.
Was Mick Jagger the person that you worked with that was most bothered about the media's view on the band and what was happening in the music press
Yeah.
and stuff?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, he was very knowledgeable, very forensic. And when I got hired, it would be, look, what's the circulation of this publication? What's this journalist doing? Who's the new reporter there? And not just UK, it would be, what's the circulation of Liberation in France? Or so he was really, really detailed. And when he did interviews, he'd want essentially a dossier before the interview of what was the last three features the journalist had written, what kind of music were they into, what was their background. And in those days, you couldn't just hit Google. It was quite hard to find out. So I'd be going and getting old copies of magazines and cutting out articles and sending it to Mick in advance. So I could say, well, this is Robin Denslow from The Guardian, and he loves African music, and he also writes about politics, and he contributes to BBC Two Newsnight. So by the time Mick would sit down with him, he'd have a real idea of who he was talking to. I mean, Bowie was like that as well. Bowie loved journalists. I mean, with Mick, he was very strategic. David really loved writers and he enjoyed talking to them. And he'd often, so he'd be talking to Tony Parsons or, Nick Kent or whatever, and he'd want to know what bands Tony was in. And then he'd actually often continue the relationships after the interviews. So journalist Dylan Jones, they'd tell me, oh, I've just had a call from David Bowie. He called up to see if I went to this gig last night or whatever. But again, the preparation that both Bowie and Jagger put into things, it was so professional. And I mean, nowadays, I'm sure that's exactly what Taylor Swift does, or at that level. But back in the 80s, probably nobody else did it. I mean, they kind of created that level. They took music to the next level, really, not just music itself, but the way it was, handled.
Something I noticed in the book with Mick Jagger and Prince particularly was like not mind games as such, but it was he wasn't sure with them at the start whether he was going to get the job or not, was you?
Yeah, I mean, there was absolutely probably was nine games. I mean, it would be a power struggle. So I thought with Mick, I'd been hired, and I had this call. I was in my office in Edgware Road about 9 o'clock. Phone rings. It's Keith Richard. I pick up the phone. He says, "Listen here, sonny boy Jim. I run the Rolling Stones, not that FF dot Mick Jagger, And he says, if you want the job, you'll be down here at Shepperton at midnight to meet me in the studio." It's like, oh my God. So I knew where Mick Jagger was having dinner. He was having dinner at a Italian restaurant, Cheney Walk. So I go around there, walk into the restaurant, and I'm kind of like sort of Dickensian figures sort of slipping in the back, and they're all like dining, And I got to Mick and I tap him on the shoulder and say, "Mick, I've just had a call from Keith, and he said if I don't come and see him immediately, I haven't got the job." And I remember Mick carried on eating. He just looked over his shoulder imperiously and he said, "Well, you better go then, better you?" And carried on eating. So yeah, there was a lot of sort of mind games. Sometimes I don't know if it's fair, but sometimes I felt like it was a table tennis ball in the middle of all these players. You just don't know. And with Prince, he was so mercurial. Wasn't exactly mind games, but he operated in a different level to the rest of the human race in a way, because he was genuinely absolutely a genius. I mean, he was like a child prodigy, he could play any instrument you wanted. He wrote the songs, he sung them. And he was very mercurial. Some days he just wouldn't talk to you. He's very shy. He wouldn't want to meet anybody. And he'd walk past with his eyes to the ground. And then other days when he would want to talk to you, could be 3 or 4 hours. Um, so you never knew where you were with Prince. Never, ever could take that for granted. Every day, every hour was different.
With the Rolling Stones, you mentioned there between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, it was like a power struggle. Would you get that with
Yeah.
most bands, or would you just deal with like one person with other bands?
What, with the band now?
In general, over the years.
Well, I know, yeah, I think it's part of rock's tradition, really. Led Zeppelin, Plant and Page, similar in a way. The Who, Pete and Roger, I mean, I think you get that dynamic because you've got maybe the vocalist and you've got the guitarist, you've got the writer, you've got the creator, you've got, that's what makes these Lennon and McCartney. That's what makes these bands great is the tension, the friction, because someone's pulling it one way. If you look at the Beatles, McCartney's emphasis towards the melodies and the tunes, and Lennon more the edge and the content of the song. If you can merge it together, you've got magic. And that's why these bands, they struggle to stay together because, they are going in different directions. It's like a football team, really, or anything. You're trying to harness, that goal scorer and that winger and that midfielder and get them all playing for the team in the same direction. You could do it and it's brilliant, but it usually only lasts 4 or 5 years and then the team breaks up and you have to, you know, rebuild.
Punk was an important time for you as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, punk was my moment in a way. Because I'd been, as I said to you earlier, I sort of was really into the pub rock, which was the beginning of punk, really. Ian Dury, Dr. Feelgood. So I was in all those venues and bands like, there was a band called the 101ers who became the Clash. So all those punk bands were really on that circuit, the Nashville, the Red Cow, and around the country, Eric's in Liverpool. It was a whole network of um, gigs. And it was a small scene at first. It felt like a couple of hundred people, really. And Manchester, of course, Pete Shelley, the Buzzcocks, and I was working with them very early on. And it felt like we all knew each other, and there were the fanzines. And certainly, if the London scene was sort of down, some of it was down the end of the King's Road. So you had McLaren, and then you had the Sex, and Pistols there. And then further out, you had the Nashville rooms where the Pistols played quite a lot, and Elvis and the Stranglers, Elvis Costello. And it was this small scene, and there was Mark P who was doing Sniffing Glue, the fanzine, and Don Letts, who was the DJ at the Roxy, and Andy Sazowski, who ran the Roxy and was also my landlord. So we all knew each other. And then I suppose when the Pistols had that incident, the Bill Grundy incident and the swearing, suddenly it was front page. Everyone was like, this youth cult, these filthy yobs sweeping the nation. Suddenly it was front page of the papers, for the next year, really. And the whole thing exploded. And there was I in quite a pivotal position because I'd been trained by Keith to work on The Who and Mark Bolan. So I understood how journalism worked or, PR worked. And I'd also met quite a lot of the Fleet Street writers in that time. So suddenly when punk came, I was like, I was part of punk emotionally and but equally I understood Fleet Street. So suddenly I was like the telecom tower, I was the connection, the crossroads. And it was a really exciting place to be. So people would be calling me up from the Daily Mirror and saying, they'd be terrified of a band like the Damned or the Stranglers, and I was the one that could deliver them safely and get them to a Stranglers gig and get a good interview with Hugh Cornwall and they get back in one piece. Because everyone was terrified, at the time, because it's a joke looking back on it. So for a year or two, I was right in the middle of it's so exciting. But at the time, you don't really think about it. It all happens naturally. Now I look back and I go, wow, right. I was absolutely in the crossroads, in the center of everything.
Who was your favourite punk band to work with?
Well, the Stranglers I was very close with because I knew them when they were the Guildford Stranglers, and my later to be my partner Ian Grant was part of a company called Albion that ran all the venues. So I knew Hugh and John, and I started their fanzine, Strangled. I mean, they still had even longish hair. They were more of a pub sort of band. But Generation X, Billy Idol, I'd known Billy at school. So Billy was fun. I loved the Buzzcocks because I thought they were just great coming up to Manchester to see them a lot. The Damned were hilarious. I mean, I kind of loved them all. It was a moment. I mean, I look now. We work with the Pistols still, and I've worked with them on and off a lot. And I've got to know over the years. I've got to know, especially Paul, Steve, Glenn very well. Less so John, and they are great guys. And I love the new, the new one, the new look with the new thing. I think they're really exciting again and playing some of their best gigs ever.
You mentioned in the book you had an interview with Malcolm McLaren about being the Sex Pistols PR. Are you glad you didn't do it at the time?
Yeah, well, I was in a way, I was gutted that I didn't do it. I was mad, desperate to do it. And Keith was my boss, and I said, "We've got to sign this group, the Sex Pistols." I'd seen them probably at the Nashville or somewhere in front of about 10 people, and it was like early, very early days. And so Keith was swept along with my enthusiasm. By the way, just going back, I was thinking, of course, when I talk about the regenerated Sex Pistols, I mean, Frank Carter, who's really sort of exciting and made rejuvenated it. But no, Keith said, "All right, well, we'll have lunch with Malcolm." And in those days, the old school place to go was a place called San Lorenzo. It was a very posh Italian restaurant in Knightsbridge. And it was the only one, there weren't that many Italian restaurants even in London then. And the roof used to roll back in the summer. So to me, it was the poshest restaurant I'd ever been to in my life. And you'd go in there and it'd be people like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor would be in there, or Michael Caine. I mean, it was really, or Elton John, it was that level. So we take Malcolm in there, and Malcolm was the most brilliant communicator. He was like an agent provocateur. So he'd be there with the hair and the gabardine coat, and he'd be saying, "My kids, we believe in anarchy and revolution, and we're going to smash the system." And we're in this sort of really straight restaurant with the waiter say, "Would you like another roll, sir?" Malcolm's right. And Keith was a features editor at the NME, and he grew up knowing Lennon and working for the Who, so he's seen it all really. And he's sort of kind of asking the straight questions like, "Well, when was your record? When is your record going to come out?" And all that. And Malcolm didn't really care about stuff like that. He just sort of like it was an explosion of ideas. I mean, to him record companies and that were really boring. So we had a good 2 or 3 hour lunch, but at the end, Keith was saying, "Well, this is what I want as my fee." I was quite modest. Malcolm didn't have any money, didn't have any intentions of paying any fees. He wasn't bothered. So unfortunately, the deal never happened. I was disappointed. But then I look back on it and I thought, well, if they had a sign with us, it might have ruined them because it would have been done in the sort of same, the same method that other bands are. So they'd have been doing an exclusive interview with the Mirror or the Daily Record or whatever, and they'd have been doing a photo for the enemy, and it would have all become like controlled like other bands. And in a way, it was better for Malcolm that he just did it his way. So I kind of say slightly seriously, but rock and roll had a close escape.
Well, the Bill Grundy incident probably would have never happened either, would it?
No, it wouldn't. And Keith would have taken the view, the PR professional view at that time, that it's bad for a group to go on TV and insult everyone and swear, and it will ruin your career. And anybody would have said that, but of course it was the exact opposite. That was the best thing you could do. And Malcolm was a real believer in chaos and anarchy, so he would stick the group in the most crazy places. I mean, he booked them in the Hippodrome, I think it was. And the Hippodrome, no, sorry, the Talk of the Town. And it's where you had people like Cilla Black doing a sort of an evening dance with. And he booked them there, and it was like, and they hadn't realized what they'd booked. And this group come out playing Anarchy in the UK and stuff like that. So everywhere they went, there was trouble. People didn't want to book them. They were thrown out. There was, I mean, I remember a gig at the Marquee, and I remember the NME editor, Neil Spencer, reviewed it, and he was absolutely shocked because the NME was the establishment then. And he said he couldn't believe it that halfway through the set, someone threw a chair And it went in and he said it wasn't a member of the audience, it was the lead singer. So, I mean, it was so really Malcolm was incredible PR in the biggest sense, and I tried to learn everything I could from him. I mean, I don't go around throwing chairs at people, but um, he really understood. I mean, he I remember this press conference he did in we were in Amsterdam. It was the day the Pistols got dropped. Wonderful bill. It was the Pistols, Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers. I was the PR for them, and the Vibrators, and I was the PR for them. And it was a club called the Paradiso. It's probably only about 20 or 30 people in this place. And it's sort of typical cold venue backstage. And, Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers used to be, Johnny was in the New York Dolls, so he used to be managed by Malcolm. So everybody knew everybody. And it was, again, like I said, it was a small scene. And the Pistols were incredible that night. Lydon was his absolute best. He was like Richard the Third, hunched up, staring eyes. I mean, he's an absolutely genius performer. And all of Fleet Street had come out because they'd heard that the fact that the Pistols had been fired by EMI was a really big story. So all these blokes in trilbies and raincoats turn up outside the venue. I mean, about 100 of them flown out from London because every paper, the Sun, the Mirror, the News of the World, the People, the Mail, the Star, you got to get the Pistols story. So they're all flown out there and they're all standing out there with their notepads. I mean, this is like, central casting. They're all Gabardine Max is another era. So my job is to talk to them. Anyway, after the show, it's really winter. It's like December or something. The canals are frozen over. So Malcolm decides he's going to do a press conference. He stands on one of the canals, on the frozen canal. The journalists are like on the banks, and someone's got a light shining it on Malcolm. And it's like a film noir thing. It's incredible. It's a shame nobody ever filmed it. And it's a bit like he gives this speech, we're going to break down the barricades. And it was a bit like flickering black and white films I've seen of Lenin in Lenin as opposed to Lennon in the Russian Revolution in 1917. And it was kind of mesmerizing. But that was a press conference like I've never seen before. And only Malcolm would have done it. The theatrics of it all were, he was naturally an incredible showman.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. From the book, we can tell that one of your favourite people to work with and like who became a friend really was David Bowie. What are some of your favourite memories of David?
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to end up working for David for nearly 40 years. So I never actually call him a friend because you never know, you never quite know what your position is you work. But I mean, I obviously spent a lot of time with him and at times was very, very close to him. I felt a connection with him. You just do with some people in life. And I don't know what it was. I don't know. We were both born in South London. Maybe we had some similarities that I didn't know. I don't know. Whatever it was. I mean, forget the music. The music's great. I know that. But I kind of really connected well with David. He loved books, vociferous reader. I mean, actually, I hadn't been to university and David hadn't been to university. So David very much was a sort of always had a lust for knowledge. Like he said, lust for life. And he's always, and I did too. So I'd always be saying, "Oh, David, have you read this book by whatever?" And David would be recommending books to me, and he'd say, "Oh, anything by Peter Ackroyd he loved, or could be quite random, medieval book like World Lit by Fire by William Manchester or Hanif Qureshi." So we had this relationship of swapping books, and I'd go out on tour with him, and I always felt I was a slice of London, really, and he'd say, "What's happening? Who's at that club? What's that new band? What's going on there? What the enemy writing about?" And always, "What's Mick Jagger up to?" So I did develop, a very close relationship. But over 40 years, you have your points where you're more closer and not closer. I mean, one of the most poignant things was my last meeting with him. And I got a message from Coco's PA said, "Could you come out to New York?" And I'd get a call like that probably once a year, especially when David made a record. He'd want to play the record to me and then me to work out the PR campaign. So Coco said, "Well, could you come out to New York?" And I looked at the diary and said, "I'll come out in a couple of weeks, great." She said, "Well, do you think you could come out in a couple of days?" That was unusual. And I thought, well, he must be very excited about the new music. So I get out there, and I go down. He's at the Electric Ladyland Studios down in the village. She used to be owned by Hendrix, but side point. And it's a big sort of sprawling studio. And I go in, it's just David in the mixing room, and he's kind of in an armchair or on a settee or something. And it's 9 o'clock in the morning. He's watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the great Sergio Leone film, which is an epic piece of filmmaking, but it's still an unusual thing to be watching at 9 in the morning, I thought, and I couldn't really work out what was in his head. I was wondering if he was thinking back to maybe when he first watched it, in the 60s, or was it the music? Because obviously he was sort of just doing the final bits of Black Star, was that theme, that sort of filmic music in his mind. Anyway, we started talking, and he was quite nostalgic, which was unlike him. And he was talking about stories in Soho in the 60s. And he was saying, oh, there was this geezer called John Biden who used to squeeze your balls, and talk about clubs and gangsters and, all of that sort of stuff. And so I was matching him. I said, David, did I ever tell you about the story when I played football with Bob Marley? Or did I ever tell you about when I was hanging out with Blondie in LA and we crashed a car or whatever? So we were swapping stories for a few hours, just like two geezers down the pub, really. And it was really like, because he's got great stories, but I had a lot of stories too. So it was quite intense in a lovely way. And then Coco came back, and it was time to go. We went down on the street. Beautiful. I mean, it was a beautiful blue sky, chilly New York day. Gave me a hug. I mean, he looked quite frail, but I didn't know. And that was the last time I saw him. And he was, he'd passed away within a few months, and he was conscious of what he was doing. He'd called me out without me knowing to say goodbye. Remarkable thing. I mean, I only realized really afterwards quite how that had been as a parting. So that was, I mean, what would I have said if I'd have known? Who knows? It would have been very difficult to handle, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you maybe wouldn't have been sharing the stories and stuff. Might not know what to say, and you wouldn't have had that moment.
I think you're right. I wouldn't have been so relaxed and casual. I'd have been a bit like, oh my God, what do I say? And do I start, can I do anything to help? It just would be, and he clearly didn't want that kind of a conversation.
Was working with somebody like David Bowie a PR person's dream?
Yes, it was mostly because you do your best work when you're working for someone that professional and who's really into it. I mean, you get people who are just like, oh, if I got to do interviews with David, it'd be always, oh, could I do some more? And he would really enjoy the dialogue with the journalists, and he'd really know about it. And he wasn't a snob. It's another thing to sort of say about David. He wasn't one of those, well, I only talk to broadsheets, or I only talk to Mojo, or I only talk to, actually, I don't know if Mojo was then, but Q or whatever. David was happy talking to whoever. I mean, if he sat down and did an interview with The Sun or the Daily Star, he could handle that, and he'd be talking about what had been on telly, or that he'd had eggs and bacon for breakfast. So he worked on all kinds of different levels. So in that respect, it was brilliant to work with him. I mean, I suppose the flip side of that is very demanding, very meticulous, very detail orientated. You couldn't bluff, you really needed to know. So if someone was coming out from, I don't know, if Dylan was coming out from GQ magazine, David want to, how long is the interview going to be? When's it going to run? Is it a front cover? Are they plugging the album? So you've got 100 little things to think about, as well as the logistics of getting the person there at the right time, the right place. So, it's the highest level of working. So your brain is going like that all the time. I mean, it's great. I learned so much. I mean, I learned the lessons I learned from David, I apply every day of my life in one way or another.
I've got to ask you, what was it like playing football with Bob Marley?
It was really cool. I'd gone out with a party. There was a guy called Hugh Fielder from Sounds, Barry Kane from Record Mirror, and I think Chalky Davis was the photographer. Anyway, it's a bunch of us. We go out there. It's like in the 70s, and we're interviewing this band Inner Circle. Anyway, that doesn't go particularly well. And Suzette Newman, who was Chris Blackwell's right-hand lady, said, do you want to go and meet Bob Marley? I go, I want to go and meet Bob Marley, you know. And he wasn't a world star at that point. He was still like on the up, but I really knew Bob Marley was, and I'd seen early shows. So yeah, so we go over there, and she said, "Look, don't when you get there." I said, "What do we do? Do we knock on the door?" She said, "Don't worry, he's got an open door policy." So we get round there, 56 Hope Road, and there was no door. So I saw what she meant by open door policy. We just walked in. And I remember on our left, there was a little drive, and it was a sort of colonial old sort of type bungalow type house. And on the left, there was some jacaranda trees and some grass and guys playing football. And it was Bob Marley and the Wailers. I said, "Come and join us. Come in." And we joined in the game. Hadn't even said hello. Um, but we're playing in this match. And then after the game, Bob takes us into a room, and it's kind of like quite just like you'd see in those old colonial things, a sort of dark wooden room. And he's playing the guitar and smoking. The spliff's so thick, the air with smoke. We can only at one point you can only see a silhouette of Bob, you know, because it's like you're trying to see through. And he's explaining to us about Rastafarianism. I'm getting that wrong, aren't I? Rastafarianism. I think I've got that correct. And you know what all that meant, and what the religion was, and what his thoughts were, really world thoughts rather than music. And between songs, so he was just chatting to us. So incredible time. And I remember we had a hire car that someone must have given us. And when we came out there, we were so stoned, even though we hadn't been smoking, just from the atmosphere. I remember we crashed the car in a ditch somewhere on the way back into central Kingston. But with Marley, a bit like with Prince, there are figures, and Bowie, of course, but there are people you come across and you go, this is much bigger than music. This is a person, he was like a prophet. You could tell, he had a vision for the world. And even now you go around the world, and you can go to the most far-flung places in Africa or somewhere, and they go Bob Marley, or they're wearing a Bob Marley t-shirt. His impact, um, his impact was just felt across the whole world. It's cultural impact, way beyond music.
With people like Bob Marley and Bowie, these big global superstars, when it's like you in the room with Bob Marley, he's telling you stuff like what he was talking to you about, does it do these kind of people attract you to them, how they're talking, the demeanor and stuff?
Oh yeah, I mean Bob Marley. He wasn't like a commercial person. He didn't talk about record sales or anything like that. He was talking philosophy. He was talking spirituality. And we're all attracted to people like that, aren't we? Like a Nelson Mandela or someone, people that have they're kind of leaders of one sort or another. And we all live our lives with ups and downs and can be quite tough. And we're all looking for people that we're all seekers. We're all looking for someone that can sort of show us the way. And certainly in the 60s and 70s, and Bob Dylan's an example, people were looking to rock stars to be much more than music to show, the way forward. And obviously 60s, 70s, you had Vietnam, you had civil rights, the world was in a sort of turmoil. And some of these music people were people that everybody looked to for guidance. I mean, now it might be I don't know, it might be a footballer or something. It changes, or it would be Taylor Swift if you're a certain age or whatever. But yeah, you know it. When you're in a room like that, it only happens now and again. Some people have got a charisma and something that's way beyond the normal.
What was
Yeah.
it? What was it like in the 90s and 2000s when the whole celebrity culture in the media was just like massive?
Oh, it was great fun. It was really exciting. I mean, it was a bit out of control. I found it a bit like people used to find it odd, but I used to say it's a bit like punk. It's all mad, and it was very like the Spice Girls I loved because it was very British, and it was very comic book, and they were sort of even though everyone thinks they're a manufactured group, but they were really making it up as they went along, and they were great fun. They were all very bright in their own kind of way. They'd all come from really normal backgrounds. They all brought their families and kids and uncles and I remember on the road with Spice Girls, they'd have a daily 12 o'clock meeting. and I'd have to come up because they were sort of managing themselves really, and I'd come up and say, "Oh," they'd say, "What have you got?" And I said, "Well, the Sunday Times want to do the this, and I don't know, Vogue want to do a cover shoot, and all this, that, and the other," and they discuss it, and they give me my instructions, and I'd go. I mean, the first 2 days with the Spice Girls, I went to see them in Rome. They were doing a press conference at a hotel. And I remember I got out of the airport and I was going down in a taxi in Rome. And my lawyer, then lawyer, since passed away, Alexis, called me and said, "Oh, I see you're in the very Via Garibaldi in Rome. What are you doing there?" I said, "How do you know where I am?" He said, "Oh, it's live on TV. They've got a helicopter following your car because it's going to the Spice Girls conference." And it just brought it home to me. I mean, this was like the Beatles, how big this thing was. And then they did the press conference. The next day, I think they went to Paris. We went to Paris in a private jet so they could go shopping at Gucci. Then the next day, they went to a disco in Madrid. I mean, it was fantastic. And the media, I mean, it was the zenith really for newspapers. They were just selling more and more. Music was on TV, and of course, you had the whole. I'd really been too young for swinging sort of London in the 60s, but this was swinging in the 90s, really. And suddenly you had Oasis and you had Blur and you had Robbie and then Tony Blair comes in and it all felt young and exciting and, Beckham and Gaz. I mean, and it all sort of happens at once. And I'd go out every night of the week, and there'd be 3, 4, 5 events and parties, and um, it was it was fantastic. But it wasn't really planned. It's like these things only happen when the planets are aligned. You can't organize it. It was just a moment in time.
What was like the first big celebrity piece that like kick-started it all? Was the one?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could say on a music level, I mean, obviously the enemy pitting Oasis and Blur together was quite something. So that became, I don't know if it was the enemy or the Nationals did it as well, but that was a moment. Robbie obviously was a bit of a, he'd be down at the Brits, sort of getting in a scuffle with someone or whatever. But with the Spice Girls, I think that's a lot of it in terms of music. And you've got to look at Simon Fuller and you've got to look at the way this whole thing. He had this idea, which was kind of a 60s idea, really, that Spice Girls should be everywhere and you can buy a Spice doll. A bit like when I was a kid, you could buy a Beatle wig. It was 2 and 6 and it was a plastic thing. You put it on and you look like a Beatle, and we had to have one. Um, but with Spice Girls, we were the same with Spice dolls, Spice posters, Spice whatever. So the marketing thing was gigantic. I remember with David, as in David Beckham, the very first interviews he did, the very first one I can remember was in Manchester, was Esquire magazine, a guy called Ian Penman. And David was so shy during the interview, he was looking at the floor and he couldn't even look at the journalist. And I told my stories to get that interview going. From there on, he went and did Sunday Times Style. And I said, "Well, how do you want to do that?" He said, "I want to look like Elvis and I want the jacket done in this way and the hair quiffed." I mean, going, can't believe it, for a footballer. And then he did a Time Out, did something with him on the cross, which was pretty controversial. So David is sort of going like that. The Spice Girls are really big there. And then David and Victoria become, a couple, and Brian Beckham starts to happen. And then there's, I suppose, one of the most famous pieces has got to be the OK Magazine wedding deal, which I did do the deal. And that they paid £1 million for the pictures of the wedding. And that's a whole long story, and it goes over a year. And then the wedding, you've got David and Victoria, you've got the England football team, you've got the Man U team. Elton was supposed to play keyboards, but he was ill that day. And that magazine sold 4 million copies. 4 million copies in a country in this country. I mean, there was nobody that wasn't talking about the wedding. Was it the purple costumes? Was it the throne? But I suppose that's where it exploded globally. And suddenly everyone was coming in from America, and Brazil, and India, and anywhere you can think of, wanting to know about Posh and Becks. And so that was probably the biggest moment, I think.
Well, I was going to ask why do you think there was so much interest in the Beckhams, but would you say it was that like clash of cultures really, like the music, sorry, the music world and the football world, and it kind of just
You're absolutely spot on. I mean, it had happened previously. If you really want to be a historian, go back to the 1950s. There was a guy called Billy Wright, who was the captain of England and Wolves, and dated. There was a girl group. I can't remember what they were called, the Beverly Sisters, and he dated one of them, and that was the first where you had a football and a pop star. George Best obviously did. He had a lot of famous, had a lot of female partners. But yes, it's the two worlds coming together. And at that point, of course, football's been reinvented. The Premiership's coming. It's on TV. Gazza's cried because before that, football had been a bit macho and geezerish. Suddenly, and Beckham was gorgeous and, fashionable. And suddenly GQ and Vogue wanted to write about it. The Spice Girls are the biggest pop group since the Beatles, really. So you put two and two together and you got about 50.
Yeah, yeah.
Like a chemical reaction. It just went insane. There was no in that era. There was nobody wherever you went, restaurant, bar, football match. There was nobody that wasn't talking about Posh and Becks. I mean, it was ridiculous. I
Do
mean,
you,
Buckingham Palace complained because they were getting so many letters for David and Victoria were turning up at Buckingham Palace. I mean, they became like the king and queen for a period.
um, like with people like the Beckhams, for example, when they're getting mobbed and like by paparazzi and stuff, is that mostly pre-planned or is that genuinely they're getting harassed?
Oh no, it was genuine. Of course, I would try and manage certain situations. So we'd have whether it was Dave Hogan for the Sun or Jason Fraser, we might have a photographer who was a friend who would be getting certain pictures. But really, when you had the mob of 50, 100 people turn up, no, that was far from prearranged. It would be cat and mouse. And David and Victoria would be trying to avoid the mob because they wanted to go on a date or go to a restaurant or something. Um, and at first, it was really exciting. I mean, David and Victoria were like kids. They enjoyed all this. Why wouldn't you? It was a wonderful adventure. But it got a bit much. It got almost terror. I don't know if terrifying is the right word, but it certainly became an enormous pressure and exhausting for them.
Well, like with somebody like the Beckhams, they're still, if a news story broke about them now, they'd still be relevant. But say somebody who was big at the time that was in the front page of the papers and magazines and stuff, and then they kind of declined, does that get to the celebrities that they're not as popular as what they used to be?
Well, I think in the case of the Beckhams, as you say, they've gone on, they've done other things, and David owns a football club here, and Victoria owns a clothes range there. So they kept moving. Um, so it doesn't really apply to them. But where it does work, where that happens a lot, is someone who basically does the same thing. So say you're in a heavy metal group and you do an album every year or two and you play Wembley Stadium, and suddenly Wembley Stadium's half empty, or your album's only sold 50 copies or whatever, then it's really, really difficult. And that's when you can get depression kicking in, insecurities, problems, all kinds of problems can come then. And a PR can play a role there. PR will often get hired. Maybe the existing one will get fired, and then PR behind. Can you turn this round? We need a new image. We need to change our look. We need to become more contemporary. And sometimes you can salvage a situation like that, because you often have groups that have gone right out of favor that are deemed uncool. And then suddenly, I mean, and maybe ABBA's an example, and some sort of innovation brings them back and they become completely fashionable again. That happens. That can be luck, can be something in an advert, or it can be something about their clothes style. A PR could be part of it. But there are bands where, when they go through that period of crash, it's like anyone in life, whatever you're doing, it's could be very, very hard to come to terms with it. And that's when people can end up going off the rails in their personal life as well.
With Beckham, he was like the first proper celebrity footballer. And I'm sure Ferguson didn't really like that. Did you ever get any stick from him or anything?
Ferguson hated it, hated it. I mean, he couldn't stand it. And he wanted David. He was totally a football man, David, and he hated all this showbiz bollocks. He really did. Yeah, I did. I remember getting a call or two from him. I mean, it was like the hairdryer treatment. It was exactly as you'd imagine. You had to hold the phone away. Well, I'm not having that. We've got to concentrate this play. I mean, he was absolutely furious. I mean, there was a thing where David, when he was dating Victoria, used to come down to from Manchester to London, and he had a transit. He'd come down in a transit van. I think he even had a bed built in it or something. But so he'd slip out of Manchester so that no one would know. And Sir Alex had spies around Manchester to make sure that David was in Manchester and hadn't slipped down to London to hang out with Victoria. So he really didn't like it.
Is there a massive PR stunt that you had planned that never came off, that you never did?
Well, I can think of massive PR stunts that went wrong. I'm trying to think of one that didn't actually happen because I suppose if it didn't happen, you might have a meeting at a record company and say, let's do I don't know, let's do an album launch in Rio de Janeiro at a sort of whatever, and they say, are you mad? That's going to cost £10 million. I mean, but there's plenty that didn't work out in the way they were expected to. I talk in the book about the one with Uriah Heep, where we go up this. Basically, if you know prog rock, you'll know Uriah Heep. Otherwise, you won't know them. And they were quite big in the 70s. And I was working for Keith, and we were tasked with making this album they'd done High and Mighty, making it a success. Now, they weren't exactly fashionable with the critics. So we would just do a stunt. And I had seen James Bond film the previous week or something. And there was this revolving restaurant at the top of a mountain in Switzerland. His Gloria, I think it was called. Anyway, we came up with this idea and we went to the record company. Said, we've got an idea. We'll take all the journalists out for lunch in a revolving restaurant in Switzerland and play them the album. I mean, you think about it, insane. And in those days, the record company should say, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Why didn't you do it? So they did. It meant hiring a plane, flying about 200 journalists out. And in those days, journalists were like, they were rock and roll with a drink. So we got to Gatwick Airport. Everyone had a couple of drinks. It was about 9 in the morning. You get on the plane. Everyone's drinking on the plane. We get to Zurich, I think it was, certainly somewhere in Switzerland. Half the journalists are hammered. There's a big bear to meet us, grizzly bear, at the airport, and it's obviously someone dressed up as a grizzly bear laid on by the tourist company. Well, the drummer Lee Kerslake, he's had a lot to drink. He suddenly gets in a fight with the bear, and they end up on the floor. And then someone from the Swiss tourist board or whatever says, "We must inform you that as you're going up the top of the mountain in the ski lift, nobody should be drinking." And I'm thinking, God, everyone's had 4 or 5 pints by then. It's a bit late. So we go up, we get up to this restaurant, and of course the altitude is an issue. And so they're lightheaded anyway, but with the altitude. And the restaurant's going round. And I mean, there was one a journalist, radio guy, and I'm pretty sure it was Alan Fluff Freeman, who was a really big Radio 1 DJ at the time. He's passed out in his soup. Just left going round and this sort of circular thing face down in a bowl of soup. Then we get the group outside the restaurant to do a photo call. And we're kind of on the sort of edge of a ski run or something. And the group are having a bit of a disagreement. They end up as a sort of scuffle. Then we're worried that one of the band's going to fall down a ravine. I mean, you couldn't make up how crazy this trip is. And when after lunch, we've got to go back to the airport, go back down the mountain. And it's like the retreat from York's Drift, in the Zulu film. People being carried down, the wounded, everyone's out of their head. We get back to Gatwick that evening, 6 o'clock. I mean, all this has happened in one day. And I remember and Keith saying, well, it hasn't really gone according to plan, has it? We've ended up with a furore fight, no photograph. We never got to listen to the album. He said, well, let's go down the pub then anyway. And that was kind of like, that's how it was.
You
But
mentioned
I saw the group interviewed about it. I didn't keep in touch with them. Ken Hensley, Mick Box. I think Mick Box they're still on the road in somewhere. And they were interviewed in a pub just a couple of years ago on a BBC program because I told this story in a BBC series I did. And They said, yeah. They said it was a lot of fun. It was a bit mad. He said, but Mick, I remember, I think it was Mick Box said, the only thing is we didn't realize we were paying for it. The record companies would pay the money and deduct it. What nobody really knew or understood was that they deduct it from the band's earnings. So, that was not a case of any publicity is good publicity. And yeah, so that was not the most successful PR trip. There have been others that have gone really even more wrong than that, actually, but that's one example.
In the book, you talk about being at the side of the stage when David Bowie's playing at Glastonbury.
Yeah.
You were at the Led Zeppelin reunion gig in London and the Prince gigs in London. What's the
Yeah.
best gig or live performance that you've seen?
Well, just before I answer that, I would say caveat when you're back, when I was at the side at Glastonbury, it sounds like incredible, but for me, it was a very stressful moment because David had said he would only allow 3 songs to be filmed, I think. The BBC were there. Mark, the main BBC guy, wanted more. And they I was literally on the stage at one point, almost grappling with the BBC guy to turn the camera off. And the cameras, the red lights on, the yellow lights on. I was saying, no, you can only do 3. And I'm a few feet away from David, who's singing, Life on Mars or something. And I'm looking out, and the crowd, it's like the Battle of Agincourt, was stretching out over the hills into the distance. Biggest crowd they ever had at Glastonbury. Because the walls had come down or something, people had got in. And there am I really having a shouting match with a guy from the BBC alongside. So it's not like you imagine in the movies, you're sort of sipping a glass of champagne watching David Bowie. It was not like that at all. But in answer to your question, I mean, that was obviously an extraordinary gig. For me, The Who at Charlton Athletic, it was about 1975, 76. And it was a great lineup. They had all these American bands like Little Feat and Arrows, not Arrows, Sutherland Brothers. Anyway, and it was a really wet, hard, cold South London day. And I mean, it was pouring. There was fights in the crowd. They kept having to stop the gig because there was so many. It was like a football crowd, really. You had the lasers there. I mean, it was one of maybe the first ever gig in a football ground in London, in the UK. And the Who were incredible. But I mean, I remember it was so wet. I still remember Pete or Roger coming and doing a guitar thing and ending up falling on the stage. But it was the height of rock and roll. Bob Marley at the Lyceum was extraordinary. That was the moment it all happened for Bob Marley, and to be there, it was quite a small gig, and that's where No Woman No Cry was recorded, because it's a live version. So I always joke I did background vocals on that track. Sex Pistols, I don't know which gig to pick, but those early ones, Sex Pistols, maybe at the Nashville, about 20 people there, if that. And it was that moment where you think, oh my God, a rock and roll is changed, actually that the whole band changed my concept of what music should be. Prince at the O2, mind blowing. I mean, I saw most of the shows there. He did 21 nights. I think I saw 16, plus I saw a lot of the other attendant gigs, and every single one was different. He had a catalogue of 150 songs each. One night he did an encore, 7 songs. So, I mean, look, obviously we could do 50 gigs and I'd still be coming up with more, but there are a few that spring to mind.
Well, you actually worked with Michael Jackson and was meant to be working on his This Is It tour. What was that
Yeah.
whole experience like?
Well, extraordinary, really. I'd worked with him for a couple of years before, and there'd been a funny court case that I'd worked for him on, a court case about recording some money that was spent and hadn't been paid back, blah, blah, blah. And then the O2, and I remember I got a call from guy called Paul Gongaware, who was working with him and AEG, and he said, we're going to put Prince on, we're going to do 50 shows at the O2. 50, I mean, it's unthinkable. And there was a press conference we organised at the O2 in the foyer of the O2. Michael was very late that day. He was staying at a hotel in Hyde Park, and for whatever reason, he was late. And I remember it was being tracked again. It was like I said with the Spice Girls, it was being tracked on TV. So you had helicopters tracking his route out to the O2 just for the press conference. I remember he went into the Blackwall Tunnel and he didn't come out. And we thought, I mean, the driver had taken the wrong turning or gone back, it was like, and meantime, I remember the press conference was scheduled for 3, and we had about 300 journalists there from all around the world. And at 5:30, the doors had to be open because they were filming X Factor there with Simon Cowell. So it was like, the clock was ticking, and we think this is going to be a disaster, all the world media. But anyway, Michael turned up and he was in a great, um, he was very relaxed. I mean, I didn't know him properly, but he was a laugh. And he was driving one of the buggies around backstage. He was like a big kid. He was great fun. And he went up there and on the stage, it was Dermot O'Leary, I think, was talking to him, and he did "This Is It," the tour, and ticket sales were insane. I mean, 50 O2s, it's unimaginable. And then, of course, I can't remember the exact time scale, but a few weeks later, we're doing a thing with the media whereby they're logging into the show. He's rehearsing, I guess, in LA or wherever it was. And we didn't have Zoom then, but we did have a facility at the beginning of Zoom where individual writers from different publications could sort of go into the rehearsals on their laptop, basically. Um, and they were chatting to like the musical arranger or the producer, and it was all like, this is going to be the most unbelievable show. I remember Kevin Mazur, the New York photographer, was there, and he was, and this is unbelievable, right? So we're all excited. I get home that night, 10 o'clock in the evening. I get a call from Gordon Smart, the son. He just says, I just heard TMZ saying Jacko's dead. What's happening? And it was like, oh my God. So I knew it was about 10 at night. So I knew that all the different PRs from my company were at various events in London that night. There was someone at a gig, someone at a restaurant. I got them all together, as many as I could, opened the office up at 10 o'clock at night. Um, and we were there all through the night, literally taking calls from all around the world. So yeah, I mean, what can I say? I mean, obviously, there's all kinds of things one could say about Michael Jackson and did this happen, didn't it happen? I don't know, but you can't really. I mean, Thriller will always be one of the greatest records ever made,
Yeah, it
and
was a
probably the
genius,
biggest
wasn't
selling record of all time. And whatever you can't. I think you kind of have to have a separation between art and artists, and that you know, yeah, he was quite something.
Yeah, in the art world, in the art world, he was a genius. But like you say, there's the ifs
Yeah,
and buts
the
about it.
whole other thing, which is a conversation in itself, and nobody really knows the full story.
Yeah, exactly. Well, another person that you worked with was Amy Winehouse in the final few
Yeah,
years of her life. There's not been anybody like her really since or before. What was she like to work with?
yeah. I mean, and you're right when you say that. By the way, she was the last. I mean, I often feel the last great British star, because she was like that. She was really down to earth and really kind of good fun. I remember going down to see when she'd played some gigs at Brixton Academy. Absolutely, I mean, really captivating, incredible. The voice, the whole thing. And I went up, I had to meet her backstage I'd been hired to sort of come up with a PR marketing plan, and must have been about midnight. And I don't know if you're familiar with Brixton Academy, like all those venues, there's a sort of labyrinth of corridors, and again, it's really freezing cold. I haven't got any heat in there. And Big Ray, Ray Cosbert, the lovely manager, he says, Amy will meet you. We went up there, and Amy will meet you now. So it's about midnight, and I go into this room. She's playing pool. And I start talking about the PR plan, and I've got a young PR with me called Selena Aponte, who's just come over from America. And yeah, and I said, oh, Ray says, this is Alan, he's got the PR plan, and that's Selena. And Amy basically made a joke to Selena about her relationship with me. I won't go into it now because I don't know. And Selena was really indignant. She said, I'm not his partner. I'm not married to him. I'm a professional PR, and it was like that. And Amy was so cheeky. Let's put it there, X-rated, risque, funny, and really, and I realized very quickly she couldn't give a monkey about a PR plan. No interest in it whatsoever. Just wanted to carry on playing pool. She was very good at pool. So she was really like really down to earth. She really lived it, and I mean that was I guess the problem. She was in the centre of all that Camden Town, and so she didn't act like a star, if you see what I mean, although she clearly was a star.
Yeah, definitely. Um,
She did it like a Billie Holiday or someone like that. If I mean, Billie Holiday's life is a tragic one to read, but the most extraordinary story and beautiful music. But Billie Holiday was sort of always kind of in the street, if you like. Same with Amy. She wasn't living in some sort of mansion, in the middle of nowhere and whatever. She was the real deal.
would you see the dark side of the press with her then, working with her?
Yeah, but I don't just blame it on the press. I mean, it's the way the system sort of worked then, because there was the newspapers were driven very competitive. Newspapers were then getting into a bit more of a down in terms of sales. They were killing each other for competitive. They had to have the pictures. The photographers all knew where Amy was. There was millions of freelancers at that time who'd rocked up in London who weren't actually operating for the papers, but knew they could go down there, get a picture, flog it to a paper. Um, so the whole thing sort of got out of control. And then obviously you've got drugs at the middle of it all. And where do you go? If you want to blame, do you blame some poppy grower in Afghanistan? I don't know. So it's easy to say the dark side of the media, but I would often have situations, and Chris Goodman, who worked with me and dealt with a lot of it day to day, he'd be calling up the news desk at the Star or the whatever, the News of the World or something, and saying, "Oh, would you mind holding off?" And they often would, and they wouldn't do anything. But because you'd have 50, 100 people turn up with cameras, it was sort of out of control. So I don't really, it's easy to say, oh, the press are all bad. I mean, I don't say that. I mean, that's not, that wouldn't be my observation. I just think it was a sort of moment in time where everything was out of control. I don't think there was a villain of the piece, not an individual villain, but of course it was tragic, and it added to the pressure that ruined her life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another like dark side of the media though is the phone hacking, and you was at the center of that as well, wasn't you? You was a victim of it.
I was a victim a lot, actually. And I suppose when you look back, and I was working at that point, Elton, Spice Girls, Bowie, Westlife, blah blah blah. Well, I don't think anyone's tapping my phone about Westlife, but you know. But yeah, so yeah, there was a lot of that going on. I mean, I kind of, it was kind of hard to talk about that in the book because it's complex and there's legal issues. But at the beginning, it was all quite innocent, really. I mean, a lot of journalists were listening to messages and finding out who was having lunch at whatever restaurant, and it all seemed quite innocuous. And a lot of everyone knew about it. It's quite transparent. Groups knew about it. Then, of course, it takes on another life, goes into politics, goes into other areas, becomes sinister, and it ends up in an absolute nightmare, really, for everybody. Yeah, not a fun time.
No, definitely not. What was it like when the internet and social media came along? Did that just totally change the PR game?
It did in a way for a while, because everybody's like, "Oh my God, if you don't do social media, you're nothing." But I didn't, I always felt and said and still think, my job has been a storyteller, and I look at something and I work out the story. I don't really care what platforms it goes on. So now, I mean, of course, I'm on Instagram, I'm on this, I'm on that. We've got people doing TikTok, we everything, but it doesn't. The job really, in a weird way, hasn't changed since I started doing it. Because someone will come in and say, I've got an album. And I'll say, yeah, okay. And they'll say it's brilliant. And that's the story. And I said, well, that's not that interesting. Who cares? What do you, and I will find out that maybe they're a keen gardener or they do oil paintings in their time or whatever it is. I always need an angle as a PR because then I can craft that into a story and build into that, the record sales or the book sales or whatever it is. Then I would go and talk to um, journalists or whatever and explain why this is interesting. And I mean, social media in a way it's a little bit like it reminds me of the fanzine punk era. In a way, it's brilliant because you can communicate with lots of people. It's very visual, which I really like. I thought PR got really stodgy in the late 90s, 2000 when it became all really corporate and all these releases which were double approved and really boring. Um, so actually, I found that this is more, you could be more creative. You can create your own things. You can put together your own visual, and you can reach a lot of people almost instantly around the world. So yeah, it did change it technically, but in terms of the ethos of the job, you could say it's even a golden age for PR. I mean, yes, I did feel like a gatekeeper where the fence had gone sometimes, but I still find the jobs basic. I mean, really, you could say I was like an electrician or a plumber. You know, you are always going to need a PR, whatever whether you call it comms person, communications. But if you go back and I don't know, you go back to Handel or Mozart doing gigs, or there's always somebody who's helping get the message out there.
Yeah, definitely. And just to finish off, you've got your side behind you. You still work for outside PR.
Yeah.
What is life like for you these days?
Incredibly busy because there's a lot going on at PR company. We've got a lot of shows this summer. We do BST, High Park shows, Victoria Park, APE, Lido. We do Teenage Cancer Trust shows. I'm doing a lot of them. We've got a Gary Kemp album. I'm really mad about Young Blood's new music, so I'm working hard on that. Obviously, as I said, with Frank Carter and the Sex Pistols, that's something. So. And of course, the book has opened other doors for me that I didn't expect, so speaking events and things like that, which is really interesting. So yeah, I feel like I'm working a sort of 14, 15-hour day, and I don't feel like it. I am really. So it's really exciting. It's great. But it is a bit mad.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I've got the book here, like I said. I Was There by Alan Edwards. It is a brilliant read. If anybody wants to get a copy, I'll leave a link in the description.
Thanks, Ethan. That'd be great.
And but yeah, thank you for your time, Alan. It's been great to hear all your wonderful stories.
It's been a really good chat, and thanks. You asked me some unusual questions there, and we went to some good places. It was good, really comprehensive. So I'll look forward to listening back to it or watching it back.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate your time, honestly, and coming on. Like I said, I did enjoy the book, and it was great to hear some stories actually coming from you. So yeah, thank you for that.
All right, Ethan. Well, thanks for having me.
Nice one, thank you.
See you again, maybe.
Yeah, bye, bye.
Bye.